The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the dry earth at the edge of town. The boy stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the paper crumpled in his grip. He smoothed the edges against his thigh, but the red ink marks remained, jagged and unforgiving. Each stroke was a record of hours spent staring at walls instead of pages, a tally of opportunities he had let slip through his fingers like sand. The air grew cool as the light turned a bruised orange, yet the heat of his own frustration burned in his chest. He traced the bold red numbers with a thumb, feeling the indentation of the pen where the teacher had pressed down in disappointment. He let out a sharp, ragged breath, crumpled the sheet into a tight ball, and shoved it into his pocket. The path ahead led toward the old banyan tree, where the shadows were already pooling like ink. He began to walk, his boots dragging slightly in the dust. The banyan tree loomed ahead, its massive, gnarled roots twisting into the earth like frozen snakes. The sage sat motionless within the hollow of the trunk, his eyes fixed on the shifting patterns of the soil. The boy approached, his boots crunching loudly on the dry leaves, breaking the silence of the twilight. He stopped just feet from the sage, his chest heaving with the effort of his walk and the pressure of his own resentment. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the crumpled exam paper, and threw it into the dust at the sage's feet. "Why does everyone insist I am wasting my life?" the boy demanded, his voice cracking. He gestured wildly toward the town, his hands trembling. "I am young. I have years ahead of me. Why should I rush?" The sage did not look up. He continued to trace a slow, deliberate pattern in the dirt with his wooden staff, ignoring the paper that lay between them. The sage finally stopped his hand. He looked up, his eyes clear and steady, and gestured for the boy to sit in the dirt. The boy hesitated, then dropped to his knees, his agitation still radiating from his hunched shoulders. The sage did not offer a lecture or a sharp rebuke. Instead, he leaned back against the thick, rough bark of the banyan, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the last of the light had faded. "Let me tell you of a man who thought exactly like you," the sage began, his voice low and rhythmic. He spoke of a king who had been walking through the bustling market square when he stopped to watch a man shouting at the crowd. This man was draped in rags, his face lined with deep, bitter creases, his hands shaking as he cursed the passers-by for his own misfortune. The king recognized the face instantly. It was a classmate from his youth, a boy who had once shared his lessons and his dreams. Seeing him reduced to such misery, the king felt a sharp pang of pity. He approached the man, offered him a hand, and proposed a singular, life-changing chance. One full day to enter the royal treasury. From the first light of sunrise to the final glow of sunset, every coin and jewel the man could carry would be his to keep. The man stood frozen in the market square, his breath hitching as the king's words settled into the heavy air. He looked at his own calloused, empty palms, then back at the king, his eyes widening with a sudden, sharp hunger. He did not wait for further instruction. He turned and sprinted toward his shack, his feet kicking up clouds of grit. His mind was already racing, moving faster than his legs. He reached his home, a cramped space smelling of damp earth and rot, and collapsed onto his thin mat. He did not sleep. He stared at the ceiling, his heart hammering against his ribs. He imagined the weight of gold bars in his arms, the cool slide of silk against his skin, and the way the townspeople would bow. He calculated the value of emeralds, the luster of pearls, and the sheer volume of coins he could haul in 12 hours. He drifted into a restless state, his fingers twitching as if they were already clutching fistfuls of treasure, waiting for the morning. The first light of dawn bled over the horizon, turning the sky a pale, promising gold. The man sat up on his mat, his eyes tracking the sun as it climbed. He had the entire day ahead of him, 12 full hours. He stretched, his joints popping in the quiet room, and felt a surge of smug satisfaction. Why rush to the palace gates when the treasure would remain there all day? He stood, moved to his small kitchen area, and began to prepare a meal. He did not eat quickly. He took his time, slicing bread, boiling water for tea, and watching the steam rise in the morning air. He sat at his wooden table, chewing slowly, his gaze fixed on the window. He hummed a low, tuneless melody, savoring the taste of the warm tea. He told himself that a man of his future wealth deserved a proper start to the day. He watched the shadows shorten on the floor, noting the passage of time with a detached, lazy interest. He had so much time, he thought, that even an hour spent here would change nothing. He poured a second cup of tea, leaned back in his chair, and let the morning drift by, completely certain that the palace doors would wait for his arrival. The tea was finished, the cup set down with a hollow click against the wood. A heavy, syrupy warmth settled in the man's limbs, a direct result of the long, unhurried meal. He stood up, but his head felt light, his eyelids fluttering with a sudden, insistent weight. He looked toward the door, then back at the soft, inviting patch of grass beneath the banyan tree outside his home. A quick nap, he reasoned. Just enough to clear the fog from his mind so he could carry more gold later. He stepped outside, the air already losing its morning crispness. He found a spot where the leaves cast a thick, dark shadow, and he lowered himself down. He did not check the sky. He did not look for the palace. He simply curled onto his side, his cheek resting against the cool, damp earth. The silence of the morning was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, shallow sound of his own breathing. He closed his eyes, drifting into a heavy, dreamless state. Above him, the sun continued its steady, relentless climb, inching higher and higher, while the man remained motionless, his fortune slipping away with every passing second of his slumber. The sun hit his face like a physical blow. He blinked, his eyes stinging from the glare that had pierced through the canopy. He sat up, his limbs heavy and sluggish, feeling the dampness of sweat clinging to his skin. The air had turned thick and stagnant, vibrating with the intensity of midday. He looked up. The sun was no longer a soft morning glow. It was a white-hot orb hanging directly overhead. He should have been at the palace gates. He should have been filling his pockets with gold. Instead, he was here, in the dirt, his heart rate barely elevated. He stood, his knees popping, and shielded his eyes against the relentless light. The heat beat down on his shoulders, making his head throb. He looked toward the road leading to the palace, then back at the shifting patterns of light and dark under the trees. It was too hot to walk now, he told himself. He would wait for the sun to dip just a fraction lower. He found a thicker patch of shade near a stone wall, lowered himself into the dirt, and leaned his head back. He closed his eyes again, convinced that a few more minutes of rest would make the journey easier. The air around him grew thin and cool. The oppressive heat that had pinned him to the ground finally broke, replaced by a creeping, damp chill. He opened his eyes, expecting to see the bright glare of the afternoon sun, but the world had transformed. The sky above the trees was no longer blue or white. It had deepened into a bruised, heavy purple. The shadows had stretched long and thin. He sat up, his heart skipping a beat as the silence of the evening pressed against his ears. He looked toward the horizon, but the sun was gone. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had slept through the entire day. The treasury gates, the gold, the promise, all of it. A sharp, jagged panic clawed at his chest, making his breath hitch. He scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling as he brushed the dirt from his skin. He stood for a second, disoriented, staring at the darkening path that led to the palace. The time for waiting was over. The time for regret had arrived. He bolted. His boots tore into the loose gravel, sending stones skittering into the thickening gloom. He did not look back. He leaned forward, head down, forcing his legs to churn against the growing resistance of his own fatigue. The path, once familiar and easy to navigate, had become a treacherous maze of roots and uneven earth. He stumbled, his shoulder clipping a low-hanging branch, but he did not slow. He pushed off the ground, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps that burned his throat. His thighs throbbed with every stride, a dull ache sharpening into a searing fire. The shadows of the evening stretched long across his path, merging into a single, dark wall that seemed to pull him back. He ignored the sting in his chest. He ignored the sweat stinging his eyes. He focused only on the distant, looming silhouette of the palace gates. The horizon was bleeding its final light, a thin, dying orange line that refused to stay. He drove his body forward, arms pumping, lungs screaming for air. His entire existence narrowed down to the singular, desperate need to reach the iron doors before the world went black. The courtyard opened before him, vast and cold. He skidded on the polished stone, his boots finding no purchase, and he threw his weight forward to keep his balance. Ahead, the massive iron doors stood like a mountain range. He saw them. The guards were already leaning their shoulders into the heavy metal, their movements slow and rhythmic. The gap between the doors was narrowing, a sliver of light shrinking with every passing second. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, hollow rhythm that drowned out the sound of his own labored gasps. He ignored the fire in his legs. He ignored the way his vision blurred at the edges. He pushed his body into a final, lunging sprint, his hands outstretched, as if he could physically hold the doors apart. The distance between his fingertips and the iron was closing, but the gap in the gate was closing faster. He reached the threshold just as the guards began to push the doors firmly shut. He threw his entire weight against the closing wood, a desperate collision that jarred his bones. The impact sent a shockwave through his shoulders, but the doors did not shudder. They kept moving, a relentless, heavy force that refused his intrusion. He screamed, his voice raw and cracking, begging the guards to stop, to wait, to look at him. They did not turn. Their faces were masks of indifference, their shoulders pressed firmly against the iron, driving the gate shut with mechanical precision. He clawed at the surface, his fingernails scraping against the cold, unyielding grain of the timber. He tried to wedge his hand into the narrowing gap, but the pressure was immense, forcing him to pull back or lose his fingers. He felt the air from the closing gap push against his face, a final, mocking breath of the treasury he had squandered. He leaned his forehead against the wood, his chest heaving, his muscles trembling with the sudden, hollow realization of his own failure. He remained on his knees, his forehead pressed against the unyielding iron. The silence of the courtyard was broken by a sharp, metallic snap. It was the sound of the bolt sliding home. A second later, a deeper, heavier thud echoed through the stone corridor as the final lock engaged. The vibration traveled through the wood and into his skull, a definitive punctuation mark on his day of wasted potential. He pulled his hands away, his palms raw and trembling, and looked up at the sliver of sky above the palace walls. The last orange glow of the horizon was fading, pinched out by the encroaching shadows of the night. The sun had vanished. The warmth that had fueled his morning was gone, replaced by a sudden, biting chill that seeped into his bones. He stood up, his movements stiff and heavy, and looked at the empty space around him. The air felt thin, stripped of the vibrant promise it had held. The opportunity had evaporated into the night air. He turned away from the gate, his shadow swallowed by the darkness. The sage stopped speaking. The silence beneath the banyan tree was absolute, pressing down on them like a physical weight. The wind had died, leaving the leaves motionless. The sage leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the boy, and his voice dropped to a low, gravelly whisper that cut through the stillness. "Every day is that treasury," he said. "The sun rises and the gates open, but the sun does not stop its descent for your convenience. When the day ends, that specific window of opportunity closes forever." The boy sat frozen. He looked down at his own hands, resting palms up on his knees. They were empty. He flexed his fingers, watching them tremble in the fading light. A sudden, sharp chill raced up his spine, making his skin prickle. The frustration he had felt earlier evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow shock that settled deep in his chest. He realized the red marks on his paper were not just failures. They were minutes he had thrown away, hours he had let slip through his fingers like sand. He gripped his knees, his knuckles turning white, as the weight of the sage's words anchored him to the earth. The boy stood up so quickly that his feet kicked up a cloud of dry dust. His face was drained of color, his skin pale against the darkening backdrop of the forest edge. He did not look at the sage. He did not offer a word of thanks or a formal farewell. His eyes were locked on the horizon, where the last sliver of sun was sinking behind the distant rooftops of the town. He turned on his heel, his movements sharp and uncoordinated, and began to run. His boots hammered against the packed earth, the sound rhythmic and frantic. He pushed his legs harder, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps that burned in his throat. Every step was a rejection of the stillness he had lived in for so long. He did not look back at the banyan tree, nor did he slow his pace when his side began to ache. He wove through the narrow paths, his arms pumping at his sides, his focus narrowing until the only thing that existed was the distance between him and his home. He was chasing the light, desperate to reach his desk before the final darkness claimed the day. The lethargy that had defined his life was gone, burned away by the sudden, terrifying clarity. The boy slammed the front door behind him, his chest heaving as he leaned against the wood for a single, gasping second. He did not wait for his pulse to settle. He moved to his room, his eyes scanning the space with a new, sharp intensity. The desk was a disaster of crumpled paper, discarded pens, and half-finished sketches. He swept his arm across the surface, shoving the debris into a pile on the floor. The sound of paper hitting the wood was loud in the quiet house. He grabbed a damp cloth, wiped the surface clean, and pulled his textbook from the shelf. He sat down, his back rigid, and opened the book to the first page. The words on the paper were no longer obstacles. They were the path forward. From the kitchen, his mother called his name, a request for help that he would have previously ignored or delayed. He did not hesitate. He did not call back later. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floorboards, and walked directly to her side. He took the heavy basket from her hands, feeling the weight of the task, and began to work without a single complaint. He was the one setting the pace. The house settled into the quiet of the night, but the boy remained at his desk. He pulled his guitar from the corner, his fingers pressing against the cold steel strings until the tips throbbed with a dull, sharp ache. He did not stop. He played the same chord progression until the sound was clean and precise, ignoring the stinging sensation in his skin. Each note was a deliberate choice, a rejection of the aimless drifting that had once consumed his hours. When he finally set the instrument down, he turned his attention back to the stack of assignments. He worked with a steady, relentless rhythm, his pen scratching across the paper as he solved equations and drafted paragraphs. He did not look for distractions. The moon climbed higher, casting a pale silver glow across his workspace, but he did not falter. He finished the final page. Just as the light reached the center of his room, he stacked his books in a neat pile, his movements fluid and purposeful. The seasons turned, but the boy did not slow. His desk remained a site of constant, deliberate activity. In the classroom, he sat in the front row, his pen moving in sync with the teacher's voice. He watched his peers glance at the clock, their eyes heavy with the same distraction that had once defined his own existence. He felt no urge to join their idle chatter. When the final exams arrived, he did not scramble or panic. He laid his paper on the desk, his hands steady, and worked through every problem with the same focus he had applied to his guitar strings. The results were posted on the courtyard wall a week later. He walked through the crowd, his gaze landing on the top of the list. His name stood alone at the summit. The realization hit him not as a triumph of ego, but as the inevitable result of his choices. He stood in the center of the bustling courtyard, watching the sun begin its slow descent, fully aware that he was the architect of his own day. Years passed, and the boy became a man of substance. He stood by the tall window of his office, his hands resting against the cool glass as the sun began its final descent. The sky burned with shades of amber and violet, a sight that pulled him back to the shade of the banyan tree. He watched the light bleed away from the horizon, the same way it had vanished from the palace gates in the sage's story. He did not reach for his phone or check his calendar. He simply stood still, breathing in the quiet of the evening. The memory of the failed exam paper, once a source of sharp frustration, now felt like a distant, necessary catalyst. He traced the edge of the window frame with his thumb, feeling the weight of the years he had spent building his life. He knew that the sun would rise again tomorrow, promising a new start. But he also understood that the hours of this specific day were gone. He watched the last sliver of gold disappear behind the buildings, his face calm, his mind anchored in the present, ready to let the day close. The final sliver of light vanished, leaving the room in soft, gray shadow. He did not turn on the lamp immediately. He stood in the quiet, letting the reality of the day settle into his bones. The sun would rise again, but the hours he had just lived were now locked behind the iron gates of the past. He walked to his desk, his footsteps steady on the floor. He cleared the surface, stacking his notes with precise, deliberate movements. There was no regret in his actions, only a profound, quiet clarity. He picked up his pen and wrote a single line for the morning. He did not fear the coming dark, nor did he cling to the day that had slipped away. He understood now that peace was not found in holding on to time, but in the act of spending it well. He pulled the blinds shut, sealing the room against the night, and sat down in the dark, ready to rest. He had learned the secret of the Treasury. He was the master of his own currency, and he was content.